Welcome to the Greatest Story Podcast with your hosts, Editing Zac here. It's come to my attention that Zac and Josh have increasingly stopped with their responsibilities over the last few weeks. And while they give the excuse that they're reading a book right now and preparing for the next episode, I think it's time for someone else to have a voice in this podcast. Someone who has done all of the work asked of them. Someone who has never failed to deliver on time. Someone who does not get things wrong. Who never appears like a foolish baboon or a ridiculous gorilla. That's right. This week on the Greatest Story Podcast, Editing Zac will finally have his debut in this week's story. My very own story. So without further ado, please enjoy this wonderful goat story by none other than Editing Zac. It all began one day in a land long ago, but not too unlike the land that we live in today, where there was a group of singing goats who would go along and sing and skip and dance and do all the things that singing goats would love to do. I will not utter their song here, since it's a mix between Oompa Loompas from Wonka and the Munchkins from Wizard of Oz. But you have the idea. With a la and a lee and a fa and a la and a do and a re and a mi, they go and they sing and they dance all day long. But in the distance, not too far and just in sight, was a mountain. The Impossible Mountain. It was, of course, named by a French goat. And the Impossible Mountain stood in the distance, a menacing reminder of what happens when you cannot sing. And unfortunately, for all of the goats, there was Jerry. Jerry was a goat who was turned into a human by an impossible curse. For as everyone knows, you should not go around insulting witches and wizards and the like, for they can be rather curmudgeon-y and have the terrible tendency of transforming people or goats into people or goats. And so, unfortunately for Jerry the goat, he was turned into a human, after in fact spitting on a frog. But it wasn't actually a frog, of course, it was in fact a witch, because everyone knows that frogs can sometimes turn out to be witches. And so Jerry the goat was turned into a human, and this was a terrible time. This was a terrible time, because everyone knows that goats and humans do not really get along, and so the other goats began to kind of kick Jerry the human, formerly Jerry the goat, out of the herd. And he became very lonely. The only goat, well, human, who was not allowed to join the other singing goats. And Jerry had a friend, Billy the goat. Now, Billy the goat becomes the central character of our story, not because Billy is particularly strong or handsome. Billy's not a human, and Billy doesn't have a particular curse from upsetting wizards or witches or the like, and he was always terribly nice to frogs. But Billy does not have good friends. Billy, in fact, is also ostracized. Billy is on the edge of the goat herd, and that's how he becomes friends with Jerry. For you see, Billy is not liked by the other goats, because Billy is not a good singer. In fact, whenever Billy would come along, the goats would always say, "Here comes Billy, here comes trouble, trouble, trouble," and then they would scream and go, "Ah!" Just like that. Trouble, 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 ah! And so Billy, with his face low, hung his head and walked away. And so Billy decides one day that he's tired of feeling this way. He's tired of always feeling on the outside, and he deserves to be mixed with the rest of the goats, even if he's not quite as good of a singer. And he talks to Jerry one day, and he says, "Jerry, what do you think that we can do to join the herd again?" And Jerry says, "Well, Billy, maybe if you do something incredibly heroic, you could possibly join the herd of goats." But everyone knows, Billy the Goat, that I can never join the herd because I am in fact a human now and not a goat. And Billy the Goat thinks for a moment, and he says to Jerry, well, that's it. I will accomplish both of these things, and we can both join the herd. And Jerry says, how, Billy the Goat? How could you ever possibly accomplish these things? And Billy says, well, Jerry, it's easy. I will save you. I will turn you back into a goat, and that heroic act will in fact help the other goats to accept us, and we can join their singing bunch. But Jerry says, Billy, how on earth could you possibly reverse a curse? And Billy says, well, it was obvious that the witch, who was not a frog, turned you into a human when you formerly were a goat by an impossible curse. And as every good goat knows, both English goats and French goats and Billy goats, they all know that the only way to reverse an impossible curse is to climb to the top of Impossible Mountain. But Jerry looked to Billy and said, Billy the Goat, no one has ever climbed to the top of Impossible Mountain. No one has ever made it alive. No one has ever made it back. But Billy the Goat says, I will do this, for you are my friend. And you will no longer be Jerry the human who was formerly a goat, but you will be Jerry the Goat who was formerly a human, but always a goat at the beginning, and now forever will be a goat. And Jerry, with tears in his eyes, smiled and says, Billy, I will help you with this task. And Billy says, I am not sure how. Humans cannot climb mountains very well, but Jerry says, I must try. And so together, Billy and Jerry set off towards Impossible Mountain, named, of course, by a French goat, and they begin, as the song of their companions, the song of their goat herd, starts to fade into the background as they approach the Impossible Mountain. And as you picture them standing in its shadow, as the world begins to go dark, almost a purple mist that seems to appear, with lightning and thunder and clouds around, a fog that rolls in as the trees themselves seem to wilter and to fall in its presence. But Jerry and Billy steel themselves, and Billy knows, as a goat, he must take the first steps. And so Billy begins that fateful climb. He begins to climb and climb and climb. All the first day he climbs. Eventually, Billy and Jerry become very thirsty, and they realize that they need water if they're to keep climbing. And step after step, stone after stone, they begin to reach the edge of their strength. But then Jerry, with his human ears, looks up and says, Wait, Billy, I can hear water rippling. And so they follow the sound, and eventually they find two streams that are running almost parallel. But they seem to intersect. And in that intersection is a little bridge and a pail of water. And the bridge seems to be tied down with the pail of water. So the only way, as they begin to investigate, to walk across the bridge is to remove the pail of water. And the only way to drink from the river seems to be with this pail of water. Because as Billy the Goat, thirsty from his travels, leans down to lick the water of the stream, it vanishes right as he goes to drink it. And so Jerry says, well, we can use the bucket to lift up from the stream. But as these two streams seem to be moving closer and closer, seem to be intersecting, Billy says, wait, this seems too easy. If we lift up this pail, then the bridge will go away, and the streams will cross. And we know that we cannot cross the streams. And Jerry says, you're right, Billy, we must not cross the streams. And so Billy and Jerry instead cross the bridge, and they go over to the other side of the rivers. And as they begin to feel once again the sun beating down, as they begin to see once again all of the water that they wish they could drink from the two streams which they cannot let cross, they realize that they must do what they have come here to do. They must keep going. They must keep going. They will get water at the end. And so Jerry and Billy the goat begin to move. And a voice speaks to them and says,
"Well done, Jerry the human, formerly a goat. And well done, Billy the goat, always a goat and never a human. You have crossed the first trial."
And Billy the goat looks to Jerry the human, formerly a goat, and they both look at each other, confused. And they say, "Voice, what trials?" And the voice says,
In order to reach the top of the impossible mountain named of course by a French goat, you will need to cross 3 trials, the first of which you have crossed now."
And Jerry the human, formerly a goat, and Billy the goat realize in that moment that the reason that no one has ever made it to the top and back from the Impossible mountain, named of course by a French goat, was because they must not have finished these 3 trials. But Billy the goat says, how hard could it possibly be? We have passed the first trial. We knew not to cross the streams. We have seen what we must do. We have to keep going to the top of the mountain. And so Billy and Jerry begin to move closer and closer up the side of the mountain as they wind and follow the trail, as they begin to move. And then they realize that maybe they haven't been moving all that much at all. In fact, they realize that they've possibly been going in circles on this mountain. And they think, how in the world can we possibly go in circles as we've been going around and around? We've been following the trail as it winds and it shifts and it moves and it curves. And Billy says, Jerry, everyone knows that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So we cannot follow the trail and we cannot follow the curves of the path. We have to go into the mountain. And Jerry says, but how will we go into the mountain? The trail goes around the mountain. But Billy the goat says, we must go into the mountain. Billy the goat says, I will take a running jump, and using my hard head and horns, for Billy the goat had much larger horns than many of the other goats, since in fact he could not sing, so his lack of musical prowess turned into very good horn usage. The irony, of course, abounds. And so, Billy moves with a rut and a gruff and a jump, and he smashes into the mountain, and behold, rocks fall away, and a doorway appears. And Billy the goat says, of course, we have to go through the mountain. And Jerry cries with a cry of delight, a secret tunnel. How exciting. And so they move into the secret tunnel, and sure enough, the path begins to straighten as a new path appears that takes them up the inside of the mountain. And then the path exits a small cave, and they realize that they are close to the top of the mountain, and a voice calls to them and says,
well done, you have finished the second trial. As you have made it through the impossible circular paths, you have realized the straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points.
And Jerry the human, formerly a goat, and Billy the goat, never a human, look at each other with joy and delight and realize they are almost to the top. And so they cry together, we are almost to the top. And they begin to move and close the distance rapidly. But as they climb this last and fateful moment, this last trek of their journey, the rocks begin to shake. The cliff face begins to move, cracks begin to appear, and Billy and Jerry begin to be separated on the face of this cliff. They are not sure what they can possibly do as they begin to fall to different ledges. And Billy the goat says to Jerry the human, formerly a goat, Jerry, you must go on without me. I don't think that I will make it. And Billy of course, tries to reach the next ledge, but he can't. Even jump as though he would, and being a goat, Billy the goat can jump quite well. He could not reach the other ledge, as the distance was just too great. And Jerry the human says, "But Billy, how can I go on when you have helped me so much to get to the top of Impossible Mountain," named, of course, by a French goat. And Billy says, "Unfortunately, Jerry, you must go alone." But Jerry looks to Billy, the goat, never a human, and says, "Billy, I'm not leaving you. Friendship will get us to the top of this mountain. Friendship and opposable thumbs." And with that, Billy steels himself for what could be his final journey. And he jumps off the cliff face as Jerry the human, formerly a goat, but definitely appreciating that he is a human now, with hands and opposable thumbs, reaches out and grabs the hooves of Billy the goat and pulls him to safety. And they are able together to climb the remaining path, and for the very end, Jerry the human, formerly a goat, stands on top of Billy the goat, never a human, in order to reach the top of the cliff, and then reaches down to pull up Billy the goat, who was never a human, onto the beginning of the end, the final stage. And a voice comes from the shadows and from the fog and says,
"Well done, Billy the goat, never a human, and Jerry the human, formerly a goat. You have made it to the top of Impossible Mountain, named of course by a French goat. And now, in honor of you reaching the end, you can have one wish."
And Billy thinks to himself and says, "I could sing. I could finally reverse all of the negative things that have been given to me. I can finally join back in the group of the goats and rejoin the herd, and no longer would they sing trouble when I come by." But he thinks, "The reason that I have come is for Jerry, my friend." And so Billy cries with a cry of anger, frustration, joy, and excitement. We wish that Jerry the human, formerly a goat, would be returned to his goat form permanently. And Jerry began to swim in a sea of stars as colors appeared and the wind picks up, and Jerry began to twirl and twirl and twirl until eventually, when the twirling was finished and the stars disappeared and the colors returned to normal and the wind died down, Jerry the goat, formerly a human, formerly a goat, was now a goat again. Finally and forever, a permanent goat. And a giant slide appeared from the top of the Impossible Mountain, named of course by a French goat, all the way down to its base. And Billy the goat and Jerry the goat jumped onto the slide, and Jerry began singing as high as he could, with such melodic vibes as it passed over the hills. And the other goats, the singing goats, who of course were singing their laws and their lees and their does and their rays and their me's and their fa's, were all singing and singing, and they stopped, as they had never quite heard this excitement and joy, this sound before. And as Billy the goat and Jerry the goat began to approach the herd, they said, "Oh my goodness, is this Jerry the goat who was formerly a human but always a goat?" And Jerry said yes, and they said, "How could you possibly have reversed this impossible curse?" And Jerry turns to the herd and says, "Billy the goat has helped me. It is through the friendship with Billy the goat that I am who I am today." And all of the goats praise Billy the goat as a hero, and they say maybe goats are not always based on what they sing. Maybe goats are based on what they do. And Billy the goat is a hero among all goats, and this is why, when someone becomes great, they call him the goat, in honor of Billy. Isn't that a wonderful story? I just hope that you've enjoyed this time with Editing Zac. Please tune in next time where we finally try and kick Zac and Josh into their rightful place and make them do some of the editing and some of the theatrical work behind the scenes and leave room for more episodes like this. Once again, we ask that you would subscribe to this channel particularly, this podcast specifically, and always to this host intentionally. Please enjoy all of the things that the Greatest Story podcast has to offer and go through our rubric and evaluate my own story of Billy the Goat. All right. We're gonna see how this goes. I've never done this before. Usually Josh is here. Make sure my voice is good. All right. Hope nothing goes wrong.